For Radio VR in Washington, I'm Andrew Hiller. While many are horrified and transfixed by the flames, death, and horrors occurring in Kiev today, it is important to remember that nothing happens in a vacuum. Events, both local, national, and international, impact how social or political movements happen. To look into the Washington effect in Ukraine, we're bringing in Dr. Paul Craig Roberts. Welcome, Dr. Roberts.
Thank you.
So, what happened in Kiev last night, the day before, the week before, that has transfixed so many and horrified so many of us, actually has a legacy stemming back years back with some influence from what we've done here in the U.S. Is that true?
Yes, of course. It all originated, I think, with the National Endowment for Democracy. The explicit purpose of that organization was to support dissent and protest in former areas of the Soviet Empire. And when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the neoconservatives in the United States grabbed hold of the institution and used it to advance their agenda of American world hegemony. So they turned it into recruiting Eastern Europe for NATO and recruiting former constituent parts of the Soviet Union and Russia itself into NATO members such as Georgia. They tried once before in Ukraine. I think they call it the Orange Revolution or something. It was back, I think, in 2004 maybe. They came very close to getting the Ukraine then. And the whole purpose, basically, let me show you how it works. What they do, they fund what are called NGOs, non-government organizations. And these organizations operate under a cloak of human rights or education or teaching democracy, but essentially they're American fifth columns. And they're designed to spread dissent within the territories that they operate and to try to align those territories with the West. So that's been going on in the Ukraine for some time. It also, in Russia, it was only very recently that the Russian government caught on and required the Washington-funded NGOs to register as foreign agents because they were causing a lot of trouble in Russia. I think the last time Putin was elected, all these groups were in the streets claiming he stole the election. That's all American-supported and inspired. And the same thing in the Ukraine. These protests, we know for a certain fact because we have the recording of the Assistant Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland, speaking to the American ambassador in Ukraine, describing the plot to take over the country. They've drawn up a list of who the American-appointed leaders will be, and we know for a fact that many of the protesters were bussed in and paid in order to swell the crowds. Of course, many were sincere, and some were very extreme elements who ended up arming themselves. And so the whole thing was directed toward overthrow of an elected government. I think what's the situation now is the moderate forces have lost control, and this agreement that's been made doesn't actually have any way of being affected if the extreme element continues in its opposition.
Now, these NGOs that you're talking about, what are some of the tools that they seem to be using? Is it mostly rhetoric? Is it propaganda? Are they actually utilizing money? You said something about busing protesters in?
Yeah, money. They use money. Well, for the protesters, they're paid. I've received all kinds of reports from all over, from Germans, from Moldavans.
And do you think they're credible reports?
Oh, yeah, sure. Well, I mean, why is anyone surprised? I don't understand the surprise. I'm really quite astonished that the Russian and Ukrainian government allowed American fifth columns to operate in their countries for 20 years. It's an extraordinary thing. And so you have both countries are full of Washington-financed organizations. They're not working for Russia or Ukraine. They're working for Washington. This was the whole purpose of the National Endowment for Democracy, was to destabilize other countries. And it once was directed as part of the Cold War. And that's how it came into being. But as I said, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the neoconservatives turned it into a tool to advance American hegemony over the world. So if they can get Ukraine into NATO, and there are NATO anti-ballistic missile bases in the Ukraine on Russia's borders, then they've essentially negated the Russian nuclear deterrent, and they've negated Russia's ability to resist Washington's will. So that's what it's all about. It's the same reason they're in Georgia. And they're just basically taking into their empire former parts of the Russian Empire and turning them into staging grounds for military bases that essentially make the Russian military impotent.
In terms of Ukraine and what's happening right now, are you seeing what you think is a snowball effect where they started a chain of events and they didn't expect it to accelerate in such a violent fashion? Are they now, the people who were in control are now out of control?
Well, I did see one of the so-called moderate leaders that the West was supporting and thought was in control, and he stated very clearly that they had lost control and were not in control. And I think when you see the violence against the police, a large number of them have been shot. A lot of them have been burned with Molotov cocktails. A large number are dead. This is not a sincere university students complaining about corruption or complaining that the president didn't join the EU. In fact, all of the demands changed instantly. The original reason given for the protests is that the students were upset that the president of Ukraine did not accept the agreement to join the European Union. Well, almost immediately, the protest was demanding all kinds of other things, the resignation of the government and so on and so on. So I think it was out of control from day one. I don't know that the people in Washington expected that. They almost always are wrong, aren't they? I mean, they were wrong about Libya. They were wrong about Iraq, wrong about Syria. Everything they expect always comes out different, but they persist in their errors. So and also, the main thing about the Ukraine is it's two different countries. All of southern and eastern Ukraine are historically Russian provinces. During the Soviet era, the Soviet leadership took these historical Russian areas, such as the Crimea, the Donetsk Basin, and stuck them into Ukraine. I don't remember the exact reason. I think it was part of the Russification of Ukraine, the encouragement of Russian language, of more Russians being in there so that the province would be wedded more securely. So, of course, the Soviet leadership didn't ever expect Ukraine to be independent. But it's two different countries, and the eastern and southern part are not historically part of Ukraine. They're historically part of Russia, and have been in Ukraine only, I think, since the Khrushchev era. So all of those people are Russians. They speak Russian. And as I understand the agreement that was made when the Soviet Union broke up and Russia let lots of the historical parts of Russia go, the agreement is that former Soviet citizens have a right to Russian citizenship. And we saw that in South Ossetia, and Georgia tried to put that down. And that will certainly be the case in the Ukraine. So if Ukraine, if the government is somehow falls under control of Washington and is put into the European Union, then the eastern and southern parts are going to separate. And there's not going to be anything, in my view, that the West would be able to do about that.
Let's go there for a second, because to the extent that the United States might have some culpability in what's happening in Ukraine right now, is there a you broke it, you bought it responsibility, or is it such that you think that the best thing the U.S. can do is just get out and stay out of the business entirely?
Well, they're not going to do that because there's only, look, these are power-mad people. They have an agenda of world hegemony. All you have to do is read their position papers. And it's been the driving force of the neoconservatives now. And we're now into toward the end of the fourth presidential term of this neoconservative agenda. And so who's in their way? Russia, China, and Iran. Well, if they can get Russia neutralized because they got the Ukraine away, then who's left in their way? Essentially only China. So I don't think there's any prospect of the Americans quitting, or Washington. I mean, the American people have any idea what's going on. They just hear whatever propaganda flows out of Washington. So I think this is a very determined effort on the part of the government in Washington, the neoconservatives. And I think it's far from over. I doubt this agreement will stand because I don't know who's going to enforce it. And it has, I think, hurt the prospect of Ukrainian independence because it's shown how weak the government is. And it's also shown, look, if you can go out and force a Democratic elected government to have an early election, then what does it mean is democracy? I mean, they could have waited until the real election. So I don't think this is over. I don't think this agreement will hold. It's quite all right with me if it does, but I just don't think it will. And I think what we are risking is a great power confrontation. The various Russian strategic thinkers have already said that NATO bases in Ukraine is a serious strategic threat to the existence of an independent Russia. So if Ukraine moves into the EU and then NATO bases are on their way, there's no doubt whatsoever that southern and eastern Ukraine are going to split off. And I just don't believe the Russians are going to give up their naval base on the Black Sea. So if the Americans push too hard, I mean, by Americans I mean Washington, of course, it's going to be a great power confrontation. Very, very serious thing. I mean, What in the world do you think Washington cares about democracy in Ukraine? They don't even have any in the United States. We have a police state, spies on everybody, the whole world. We have the media as a propaganda ministry. It's worse than it ever was in the Soviet Union. The people have no idea what's going on. Well, and what they're told about the Ukraine is a fabrication.
Looking at the state of Ukraine and Washington's role in the protests, I'm Andrew Hiller for Radio VR, and we have been joined by Dr. Paul Craig Roberts. Thank you for your insight, sir.
Pleased to speak with you.